The wisest being in the galaxy chose to hide.
That choice has always been treated as wisdom. It wasn't. Everyone remembers the moment. The Senate chamber, the blue light of Palpatine's lightning still crackling at the edges of memory. Yoda, 900 years old, the most powerful Jedi who had ever lived. The embodiment of the Order's philosophy, fought the Emperor to a standstill, lost his footing, and disappeared. The official version is clean, almost elegant. Yoda recognized that he could not win. He retreated not out of cowardice, but out of foresight. He would wait. He would preserve himself for the moment when the galaxy needed him most. He would watch over the children of Anakin Skywalker from the shadows, biding his time until the Chosen One's offspring grew strong enough to finish what the Order had failed to do. This is the story the Jedi Order would have told, if the Jedi Order had survived to tell stories. It frames exile as sacrifice, as patience, as the long game played by a master whose wisdom exceeded the moment's violence. But there's a version of this story that nobody asks about. A version where Yoda doesn't leave. A version where the most powerful Jedi Master in history stays, fights, and refuses to let the galaxy fall into 23 years of darkness without at least making the Empire pay for every inch of ground it takes. What would that version look like? Not the heroic version, not the mythologized one. The version that actually makes sense if you're willing to ask what Yoda not going into exile actually means for everyone who suffered while he watched from the swamp. The first crack is the simplest one, and it's been sitting in plain sight since the moment we understood what exile actually required. Yoda went to Dagobah, a remote, force-shadowed swamp planet at the edge of the Outer Rim. He lived alone for 23 years, eating what the swamp provided, meditating, communing with the ghost of Qui-Gon Jinn, and waiting. He watched the Empire rise. He watched the Purge execute the last remnants of the Jedi Order. He watched the construction of the Death Star. He watched Leia's adopted planet, Alderaan, a world of 2 billion people, reduced to debris while he sat in a cave. And the question that never gets asked loudly enough is this: what exactly was he preserving himself for? The answer the official version provides is, for Luke. He was waiting to train Luke Skywalker. But Luke only came to Dagobah because of a Force vision he experienced in the aftermath of a battle Yoda had nothing to do with. He came because Ben Kenobi's ghost directed him there. Which means if Obi-Wan had died differently, if the timing had shifted even slightly, there is no guarantee Luke ever finds Dagobah at all. Yoda's entire 23-year plan depended on a chain of events he couldn't control, involving a student he'd actually recommended against training, guided there by a ghost on the basis of a Force vision. That isn't a plan. That's a hope dressed up as strategy. And if that's what it actually was, a hope, then the decision to retreat starts to look less like wisdom and more like the action of someone who had run out of better options and needed the retreat to mean something, which raises the next crack.
Because Yoda didn't go into hiding after a long strategic deliberation.
He went into hiding after a single duel that he didn't lose a duel, he actually survived, physically intact, against the most powerful Sith Lord alive. He fell from a pod in the Senate chamber. He was collected by Bail Organa. He was alive. He was uninjured in any meaningful sense. And he decided, in that aftermath, that the fight was over. The implication is hard to ignore. Yoda didn't retreat because he calculated that exile was the optimal strategy. He retreated because the duel against Palpatine shook something in him that went deeper than tactics. He had believed for decades that the Jedi were guardians of peace. He had believed in the Order's sufficiency. And then, in the space of 2 days, the Order had been exterminated by its own soldiers. Anakin Skywalker, the Chosen One, the Jedi's greatest hope, had turned against everything they stood for, and Yoda himself had fought the Emperor to a draw and come away with nothing. The official story says Yoda was wise enough to recognize a lost cause, but the cracks suggest something different. They suggest Yoda was exhausted, destabilized, possibly for the first time in centuries, genuinely uncertain whether anything he had believed was true. And that's only possible if the exile wasn't entirely a choice, if the exile was, at least partly, a collapse, which means the 23 years weren't just strategic patience. They were, in part, a recovery period for the most powerful Jedi in history, a recovery that cost the galaxy everything he could have prevented while he was healing. Here's where the dread pressure arrives. If Yoda had stayed not in some heroic charge back into Coruscant way, but simply stayed active, stayed in the fight, continued to move through the galaxy, the calculus of the Empire's first decade changes completely. Not because Yoda could have defeated Palpatine alone, but because the early Empire was not the entrenched totalitarian machine it became. It was new. It was consolidating. It had enemies it hadn't yet eliminated, systems it hadn't yet brought to heel, officers whose loyalty had barely been tested. The early Empire was, in ways the rebellion in its later form never fully appreciated, vulnerable. And Yoda knew where every vulnerability was.
He had been on the Jedi Council for centuries.
He had participated in every major strategic discussion the Republic had conducted. He knew the names, the locations, the political fault lines, the military commanders who could be turned, the systems that resented Palpatine's centralization even before the Senate was dissolved. He had, in other words, an intelligence advantage that no one else in the galaxy possessed, and he took it to a swamp. The question that never gets asked, what if he hadn't? Let's build the scenario carefully, because the version most people imagine is wrong. The wrong version is Yoda as a one-man army, storming Coruscant, battling Vader, engaging the Emperor in endless single combat until something breaks. That version misunderstands what Yoda's actual value would have been, and more importantly, it misunderstands what the galaxy looked like in the months immediately following Order 66. The right version is quieter, more dangerous, and in some ways, more disturbing in its implications. In the months after the Empire's declaration, the galaxy's resistance was scattered but real. There were Jedi survivors, not many, but some. Canon was alive. Ahsoka Tano had survived. There were officers in the Republic's military who had not yet decided whether to serve the Empire wholeheartedly or wait for something better. There were Senators Mon Mothma, Bail Organa, Padme Amidala's allies who were already beginning to plan, to organize, to consider what opposition might look like. What none of them had was a center. The early rebellion's greatest weakness wasn't resources or courage, it was coordination. It was the absence of a figure with enough authority, enough respect, enough institutional knowledge to pull scattered threads of resistance into something coherent. Someone every surviving Jedi would follow. Someone whose name alone would cause hesitation in officers contemplating the Empire's orders. Someone whose presence would signal to wavering systems that the galaxy hadn't simply surrendered. Yoda was that person. Not as a warrior, as a symbol, an anchor, and a strategist.
Consider what his presence would have meant to the surviving Jedi.
Canon spent years hiding what he was, suppressing his connection to the Force, living in fear of what it meant to be identified. He had no guidance, no community, no context for understanding what came next. He had been a Padawan when Order 66 hit. He was a child who watched his master die and then spent a decade pretending to be someone else. What would Yoda's presence have done for him? Not on Dagobah in the galaxy, moving, accessible, leading. It would have meant that survival wasn't the ceiling, that there was still something to survive for, and Kanan wasn't alone. The question of how many Force-sensitive individuals quietly faded, gave up, or were eventually caught and executed during those early Imperial years because they had no community, no teacher, no reason to believe that holding on was meaningful. That question doesn't have a clean answer, but the answer is almost certainly more than survived. Here's where the motive beneath the motive becomes visible, because Yoda's exile didn't just remove Yoda from the equation. It removed the possibility of organized Jedi resistance during the window when organized Jedi resistance was most viable. The Empire spent its first decade consolidating precisely because it wasn't seriously challenged. That window. The inquisitorious Vader's hunters were effective not because they were more powerful than the surviving Jedi, but because the surviving Jedi were isolated, unsupported, and uncoordinated. They fell one by one, each loss making the next more likely. A Yoda who stayed would not have prevented all of those deaths. But even influencing the survival of a handful of additional Jedi changes the Resistance's composition, changes what the rebellion inherits, changes the state of the Force itself when Luke Skywalker finally begins to feel its pull. Which brings us to the implication that the official version works hardest to avoid.
Yoda knew all of this. He was 900 years old.
He had seen the galaxy's patterns repeat. He understood, better than anyone alive, what isolated survivors look like compared to coordinated resistance. He understood that the early period of any authoritarian consolidation is also its most precarious period. He understood that symbols matter, that the Jedi's surrender, their disappearance, their vanishing from the galaxy's consciousness would do as much to cement Imperial authority as any military victory. And he went to Dagobah anyway. The most charitable interpretation is that he genuinely believed the approach would work, that Luke would arrive, be trained, defeat the Emperor, and restore balance. That the passive strategy, however costly in the short term, was genuinely the right call. The less charitable interpretation is that the decision was made, at least in part, by a being who had lost faith. Not in the Force, not in some abstract sense, but in the specific thing he had spent centuries building the Jedi Order, its methods, its approach to power, its relationship to the Republic. And that going back into that world, trying to rebuild, trying to organize, would have required him to confront the ways in which the Order's own failures had contributed to its destruction. Exile, in this reading, wasn't just tactical withdrawal. It was avoidance. The most powerful Jedi in history, the one who perhaps bears more responsibility for the Order's philosophical rigidity than anyone else alive, retreating from a galaxy that was partly broken by the very approach he had championed. That's not a comfortable thought, but it fits. And if that's what happened, then Luke's training on Dagobah carries a weight that the films never quite name. Because Luke isn't just learning from a wise old master. He's learning from someone who made the worst strategic error of the post-Clone Wars era, who watched 23 years of suffering from the relative safety of a swamp, and who has spent those 23 years trying to figure out whether any of it was actually wisdom or whether it was the most elaborately justified retreat in galactic history.
Let's be precise about what changes if Yoda doesn't go into exile.
Not mythologically, practically. The Death Star. The Death Star is the clearest, most measurable consequence of the Empire's unchallenged first decade. Its construction required years, enormous resources, a workforce drawn from across Imperial territory, and the sustained institutional capacity of a government that was never seriously threatened during the project's most vulnerable stages. An active Yoda, even one working in the background, even one who never directly fought the Empire in open battle, changes the intelligence picture around that project, changes the likelihood of early exposure, changes the political climate in the systems being taxed and conscripted to build it. Alderaan's destruction isn't an isolated event. It's the product of a machine that had 20 years to perfect itself in the absence of meaningful opposition. The 2 billion people on that planet died at the end of a process that a different choice in the Senate chamber might have interrupted. Not erased, interrupted. And that interruption doesn't require Yoda to be omnipotent. It only requires him not to have disappeared. Here's what else changes. Leia Organa grows up in a galaxy where the Jedi are not myth. She grows up in a galaxy where, however diminished and scattered, the Jedi are present. Where Bail Organa, who knew the truth about her parentage, who helped hide her, who carried the secret of Vader's children through the entire Imperial period, isn't the only living connection between the old world and the new one. Leia's entire arc in the original trilogy is shaped by absence, by loss, by the experience of fighting an empire that seemed absolute, permanent, and total. Her hope is hard-won precisely because the galaxy she inhabits offers almost no reason for it. A Yoda, who stayed, doesn't make that easy for her, but it makes it less impossible. And then there's Anakin.
This is the part that almost never gets discussed.
Because if Yoda had stayed, if he had remained active in the galaxy, if he had continued to develop his connection to Qui-Gon's ghost, if he had continued to evolve his understanding of what the Jedi had gotten wrong, the possibility of redemptive contact with Darth Vader doesn't disappear, it increases. Not a confrontation, contact. The idea that Vader was completely unreachable during those 23 years is an assumption the official version requires us to make, because Yoda made no attempt to reach him. But Luke was able to feel Vader. Vader was able to feel Luke. The Force connection between them was strong enough to transmit across star systems. Yoda and Anakin had trained together for over a decade. Yoda had known Anakin since he was a child. The bond between a master-adjacent figure and a student of that intensity doesn't simply evaporate because one of them turned. The implication, and it's one the narrative carefully avoids, is that Yoda have tried. That some form of contact, of reaching across the darkness, was possible in ways nobody attempted because the official strategy required Vader to remain a problem to be solved by Luke rather than a wound that someone who had known him might have been able to address. This doesn't mean Vader would have turned. He might not have. The darkness in him was real and deep and had been building for years before Order 66. But the possibility that he might have turned earlier, that a different kind of engagement with the person inside Vader might have changed the timeline, that possibility was never tested. Because Yoda was in a swamp and Obi-Wan was on Tatooine, watching from a distance, practicing a kind of loyal paralysis that mirrors Yoda's own. It almost feels, when you look at it this way, as if both surviving Jedi Masters made the same mistake at the same time, a mistake built into their understanding of what the Jedi were supposed to do in the face of a lost battle. Stand down, wait, trust the Force to resolve what they couldn't. That instinct, however ancient and however grounded in the Order's tradition, left the galaxy to pay the price for their patience. 23 years of price. Here's the cost that gets measured in numbers we don't have but can feel.
Order 66 killed thousands of Jedi in a single night.
The Inquisitorius and the early Imperial Purge killed hundreds more over the following years. But the real toll isn't in the Jedi who died. It's in the Force-sensitive children who were never found, never trained, never given a framework for what they were experiencing. Children who might have grown into healers, or negotiators, or teachers. Children who instead grew up feeling something strange and frightening at the edge of their perception, with no language for it and no community to receive them. The Force doesn't stop creating. The galaxy doesn't stop producing people with sensitivity to it. They just stop being found. In a galaxy where Yoda went into exile, those children grew up alone. In a galaxy where Yoda stayed, even quietly, even carefully, some of them didn't. That's not a small difference. That's potentially the difference between a rebellion that has Force-sensitive members scattered through its ranks by the time the Death Star appears, and a rebellion that has exactly one who learned about the Force from a dying old man on a ship he'd never been on before, with no real training and no real community to catch him if he fell. Luke almost failed, multiple times. He nearly drowned in the dark side cave on Dagobah. He abandoned his training too early. He faced Vader before he was ready and lost his hand and his certainty simultaneously. He survived by luck and connection, and something in him that the training barely had time to reach. If the scaffolding around him had been richer, if the rebellion he fought for had a deeper Jedi tradition running through it, if the Force sensitives around him had been trained and present and capable of holding some of the weight, the specific moments where Luke almost broke might not have been so acute. And if Luke had broken, if the darkness had taken him at any one of several points, where it almost did, then the rebellion wins a military victory over the second Death Star and loses Vader's redemption in the same moment, which means Anakin Skywalker dies as Darth Vader. The Chosen One never fulfills the prophecy. And all of that traces back in a chain of contingency that the official version doesn't invite us to examine, to the moment in the Senate chamber when Yoda chose to stop, not because he had to, because he believed stopping was wisdom.
Here is where the question opens rather than closes.
The official version of Yoda's exile asks us to accept that patience is always a form of wisdom. That withdrawal in the face of overwhelming darkness is a strategy rather than a surrender. That watching from a distance while the galaxy burns is acceptable if you're preserving yourself for a future moment whose specific shape you cannot predict. But what if the lesson the Force was actually teaching during those 23 years wasn't about patience? What if it was about the cost of certainty? Yoda's greatest error, the one that contributed most directly to the Order's fall, wasn't that he trained the wrong students or made the wrong tactical decisions. It was that he believed absolutely and without doubt that the Jedi's way of understanding the Force was complete, that there was nothing left to learn, that the accumulated wisdom of 900 years was sufficient to meet whatever the galaxy produced, and then the galaxy produced Anakin Skywalker, and the Jedi's certainty about how to handle him broke something in both directions in Anakin, who never felt truly seen or trusted, and in the Order, which couldn't bend far enough to receive who he was. If Yoda had stayed, if he had remained in contact with the galaxy's pain rather than retreating from it, the thing that might have changed most isn't the military balance. It's Yoda himself. A version of Yoda who spent 23 years actively engaged with what the Order had gotten wrong, who watched Canon struggle and helped rather than observed, who attempted to reach Anakin through the darkness, rather than waiting for a son who didn't yet exist to do it for him. That version of Yoda emerges from those years different. Not just older, changed. The Yoda who trains Luke on Dagobah is still, in crucial ways, the same Yoda who ran the Jedi Council, still certain about the dark side, still convinced that attachment is the primary enemy, still operating from a framework that had already failed once and was, in some of its most fundamental assumptions, part of the reason it failed.
Luke senses this. He pushes back.
He refuses to accept that Vader cannot be saved. He refuses to accept the Council's old certainty about what attachment means, what love means, what it costs to believe in someone even when the evidence is against you. And Luke is right. The Jedi's philosophy, in its final Dagobah form, still carries the seed of its own destruction. The only reason the sequel generation manages to navigate it differently is because Luke himself broke from it at the crucial moment, chose Vader over the old Jedi way, chose attachment over doctrine, and was vindicated. Which raises a possibility that the official story doesn't want us to sit with too long. What if the exile, the long, isolated, swamp-bound 23 years, wasn't just Yoda avoiding the galaxy? What if it was the Jedi philosophy protecting itself from having to change? What if the real reason the oldest surviving master retreated to the farthest possible edge of the galaxy was that staying would have required him to confront, in real time, with real consequences, everything the Order had done wrong, and that confrontation might have broken the framework entirely, rather than preserving it just enough to pass to one final student? That's not a question the official story can afford to ask. It's almost certainly the question that matters most. The wisest being in the galaxy went into hiding. The galaxy paid for 23 years. And the student who finally trained under him had to break from his teaching at the exact moment it counted most to save the man the teacher had given up on. That's not wisdom failing. That's something else. What do you call it when the teacher survives, and the lesson still costs everything? If you want more Star Wars truths that are rarely examined, you know where to find them. If Yoda had stayed, if he had made even one different move in that Senate chamber, where do you think the galaxy's story changes most dramatically? Is it the Death Star, Vader, Luke himself? Leave your answer below, because the thread that unravels first might not be the one you expect. And if this made you see Yoda differently, if the wisest master in the galaxy now looks a little more like someone who blinked subscribe, there are more of these moments